Now, in part 1 of the Iliad, Franklin had a lot of issues by being attacked 3 times, which was himself, his family, and Leon. And the big question was, who was carrying out these attacks? And as part 2 revealed, it was Kevin's brother, KANE. But we're gonna get to that in just a moment. But let's recap part 1 first, and then transition into part 2, starting with the investment deal that Franklin put in front of Louis and Jerome, which he was banking on, because without their investment, he couldn't move forward with his own plans. But the problem is, Franklin's dream aren't Louis and Jerome's, because they have plans of their own, and $10 million is definitely a lot of money. But he did say at the beginning of the season, nothing tears a family apart like money. And ironically, in part 2, we saw Franklin lose $5 million's worth, to be precise. Now, we also had Sissy, who had a meeting with Ruben again, where he wanted Sissy to put a recording device in Franklin's office, because he wanted to learn everything from drug deals to offshore accounts, and who the major players were. But there is a fine line you just don't cross, and there really was no way Sissy was gonna bug her son's office because of what Alton did, which almost destroyed their family, so Sissy wasn't gonna take the risk. But let's talk about the ambush and the drive-by attacks, because this is what will lead us into part 2. Now, when Franklin and Teddy have ever done deals and re-ups, very rarely do we see things going south, because I'm sure they're both very careful that they're not being followed. But it wasn't the case in this instance, where there was a fierce shootout where Teddy was wounded badly, where Gustavo was grazed, and Franklin's new bodyguard being killed. But Teddy came out the worst, where he was losing a lot of blood and even splashing some of his own product on his wound to numb the pain. But he ended up at Parisa's house, who he knows from his time in Tehran, who helped fix him up. But on the other side, we had Franklin and Gustavo, who were carrying $3 million in cash in East LA, which I don't think they wanted to be in, rolling with $3 million. And when they came across these Mexicans, we knew it was going to be trouble. But when Franklin was hit, he did manage to get in touch with Jerome to let him know what happened. And this was the last time Jerome heard from his nephew, but he knows that he's a survivor, because that's just who he is. But these attacks wasn't just on Franklin, they also came after Leon while he was at Arvy's, where he actually managed to take one of them out, as well as one of Kane's guys, killing one of Arvy's men. Now, they also came after Jerome, Sissy, Louis, and Veronique, while Sissy was trying to convince them to have a backup plan from the game, even if it wasn't accepting Franklin and Veronique's investment idea. But we saw them getting lit up as well, where they were stuck with law enforcement. We saw Franklin and Gustavo being stuck by being chased by these Mexican, first by hiding, but ending up behind a cage in front of a tiger, and who would have ever guessed this? And this is where part 1 finished. So as part 2 picked up from where they left off, and before Franklin came face to face with his former best friend Kevin's brother, who was behind the attacks, he had to first fight his way out of this cage. So we saw Gustavo jamming the lever, which was very clever on his part, and we actually saw a complete contrast in behavior from Gustavo and Franklin Sane. Where Franklin was panicking, Gustavo had a very calm head on his shoulders, where he wasn't wasting his energy on screaming or shouting, but rather thinking of the next move to get them out. And his thinking did work at the expense of this crazy old man who has a tiger in his back garden. But as they made their escape, they found themselves in trouble again, where they were taken by the same Mexicans that were chasing them in part 1. Now, they were battered and bruised, but there was no way they were going to give up the money. But where Gustavo made the plan to get the two out of the cage, it was now Franklin Sane's turn to save Gustavo, but he couldn't tell him his plan. So Gustavo really had to have faith that Franklin would come back for him, because he was staying back as insurance. But Franklin's plan was to take them back to the money, so he said anyway. But when he said this, I knew there was only one place he was taking them, and that was the tiger's den. And when he arrived, we saw the tiger taking one of the guys out, which allowed Franklin to escape and come back and get Jerome and Leon, where they went and saved Gustavo. Now, at this moment, Franklin was still confused about who was carrying the attacks on him and his family, because there were 3 coordinated hits, and he said he didn't see any of them coming. But Gustavo said eventually they will show their faces, and you can only hide for so long. But they returned back to the club where Louis, Jerome, and Leon had Dallas and Black Diamond, because they weren't trusting anyone. But before we come to the questions that were raised about Peaches, we also saw Gustavo embracing Jamera. But when it comes to Veronique, while Franklin was away with Sissy, she may have indirectly caused Veronique to think about her position with Franklin. And even though she was someone who accepted him for who he was and the game he was in, but after Sissy's talk and the drive-by shootout, these 2 elements would have played a huge part in her deciding to leave Franklin. But they do meet again when she has a baby scan, where Veronique doesn't sound too convinced that she'd be safe with Franklin, even if he was to pull some of Arvy's best bodyguards, and she said she'll be around with their business. But until Franklin was fully out the game, she said she wouldn't be there with him, because she said Franklin can't keep her safe. so she needed to create this distance. But on the conversation that Franklin had with Harvey, we see Franklin doing Franklin Saint things, where he's questioned or challenged in any sort of way. He tilts his head to one side. But Harvey tells him when he first met him, he was a young man, and he knew that he could do anything he wants, and be anything, a teacher, a businessman, or a drug dealer. But that's the biggest curse a man can have, because for someone like Harvey, he has one path. And for example, let's take Teddy. He also has one path that he's chosen, but Franklin Saint has the power and ability to do so much with his life. But that's the problem, because he's actually stuck in these two worlds. This world where he earns endless amounts of money being this drug dealer, and then on the other side, he's got this business in real estate. And Harvey told him, where he goes from war to war, a man like Franklin Saint has a war inside. And this is because he's always fighting with himself, and the choices that he makes, sometimes wrong and sometimes right. And something which he failed to see was not realizing that Peaches was the one to betray him. So let's come back where questions were raised about Peaches. Now at first, Jerome shut them down, because he was the one who introduced Peaches to Franklin. This is why he was heartbroken when the truth dawned on him. But over the course of the season, Peaches seems like he was suffering from an illness, which could very well have been AIDS. And we saw him shook in episode 4 when Franklin turned up. And I did mention a few weeks ago, we were long overdue for someone close to Franklin Saint to betray him, and Peaches proved to be that guy. Because all the clues and evidence pointed to one person, and that was Peaches. Because when his stash was hit, it finally made sense, because the only people that knew about this place was Franklin and Peaches. But what also could have played a role in Peaches betraying Franklin was when Franklin killed Rob in front of Peaches, which he must have been thinking, if he can do this to Rob, then at some point in the future, I could very well be on his hit list. But you could sense Jerome was really hurt by the betrayal. But Louis said, don't blame yourself. Even though he was the guy who introduced him to Franklin, Louis said that he turned into Franklin's bodyguard, and if anyone should have seen it coming, it should have been Franklin. But it doesn't stop Jerome's hurt, which turns into anger and blood when they were pressed about a delayed re-up. And this was Jerome unleashing all his anger that he had inside, because Peaches really did break his heart. But to pull this move off, which was 3 coordinated attacks, would have required a lot of planning, money, which buys manpower, and there's no way he could have pulled it off on his own. And putting Black Diamond and Dallas on the streets, they get the word that it could be some OG named KANE, who just got out of the joint. And Franklin and Leon knew exactly who KANE was, and we were introduced to him when Leon and Franklin went to meet him. And this is Kevin's brother, who Franklin mistakenly killed in season 2. And here's where KANE revealed he'd been out for a few months, but he'd been patient because he'd been looking after his broken family, who Franklin was responsible for when he killed Kevin. But KANE, Franklin, and Leon go way back when they were kids, and KANE even said he taught them a lot of things. For example, how to behave like men. But this is why Franklin and Leon were here, because they were behaving like men, looking for answers whether Peaches was the one who approached KANE, or whether KANE approached Peaches, but he didn't get his answer. KANE was someone who was so fixated on the broken families that he had to take care of because of Franklin, and that was his brother Kevin dying at the hands of Franklin, as well as his cousin Delroy, who was killed working for Franklin. And he mentioned he was so angry that he couldn't even bring himself to go to his own brother's funeral, so instead, he sat and waited patiently. And for someone to wait patiently inside, as well as being released and waiting a few months to strike, you really get the sense that KANE is strategic, calm, and will pick the right moment to strike. And this is what makes him so dangerous. But he also questions Franklin what happened when he shot Kevin, because he went prison, and he was released quite quick, with the help of Teddy of course. But you can see why KANE asked the question, because there is only one way you get out so quick and quietly, and that's if you snitch. But where Leon and Franklin came to make shit right, there are some things you just can't fix, because things will never be the same, and can't be forgiven. And KANE warned him, he can come at him all he wants, but he's not hiding. And this is going to be a tough battle for Franklin, something which he didn't need to add to his plate, with Sissy working with Ruben, Jerome and Louis turning him down on his investment, Veronique putting distance between them, and there's also Teddy who's acting paranoid after he killed Alton, and who knows what else. But there is a lot of violence that has been foreshadowed to come between KANE and Franklin, because neither will back down, and talking is done. So the only way is a war, and either KANE wipes out Franklin, or Franklin wipes out KANE and his boys. So shit is really heating up as we move into the business end of the season for Snowfall, season 5. But just before we finish, there was also Teddy and Parisa, who revealed that she has always had a thing for him back in the day, when they used to work together in Tehran. And maybe it's not money that she wants, but him instead. And that was part 1 and 2 of the Iliad. And of course, the major talking point is KANE, who's going to be a real villain over the last stages of season 5. And this final conversation really would have sent the shivers down your spine, because you can tell KANE isn't afraid of Franklin. So let's see what Franklin's next move is, or what KANE's next move is, because he said next time he makes a move, he's gonna get it right. So I'm sure Franklin will have his shit tight and locked up. And when Leon turned down the firepower from RV in part 1, they may just need it to take out KANE and his boys. But drop all your thoughts down below on Kevin's brother making his introduction and his warning shot to Franklin saying. So drop all your thoughts down below in the comment section. And of course, if you're new to the channel and you haven't done so already, then remember to smash the subscribe button if you want to see everything Power Book 4 Force, Snowfall and Top Boy related. But as always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.